45%, that is the number now hanging over every truckload of Canadian softwood lumber crossing into the United States. 45% in combined duties and tariffs. The highest effective rate in the modern history of the US-Canada lumber dispute. And it is landing directly on the American housing market at the worst possible moment. This is not an abstract trade fight buried in policy journals. This is framing lumber for a 2,000 square foot home in Ohio. This is roof trusses in Texas. This is subflooring in Arizona. And according to American builders themselves, these tariffs are adding thousands of dollars to the cost of every single new home built in the country. The National Association of Home Builders has warned Congress repeatedly. They estimate tariff actions are adding nearly $11,000 to the cost of a typical new home. Even conservative calculations show $3,000 to $5,000 per unit in direct lumber-related increases once the 45% rate fully filters through supply chains. That increase does not disappear. It gets passed on to buyers, to families, to mortgage holders already struggling with elevated rates. Housing affordability in the United States was already fragile. Mortgage rates remain high. Inventory is historically tight. The country is short millions of homes. And into that environment, Washington layered tariffs that effectively doubled the duty burden on its largest foreign lumber supplier. Canada provides roughly 85% of U.S. lumber imports and nearly a third of total American lumber consumption. That is not a marginal supplier, that is structural dependence. American sawmills do not have the spare capacity to immediately replace that volume. The U.S. Forest Service has noted that the country grows more timber than it harvests, but harvesting trees is not the bottleneck. Processing them is. Building new sawmills requires years of capital investment, regulatory approvals, and workforce expansion. Home builders do not operate on decade-long timelines. They operate quarter to quarter. They need lumber now. So when tariffs rise from roughly 14% to 35% through anti-dumping and countervailing duties, and then another 10% is stacked on top under a Section 230 to national security justification, the impact is immediate. Costs rise, budgets break, projects stall. Housing starts fell sharply in 2025. Builders began offering aggressive incentives just to move buyers off the fence. Two-thirds of builders reported discounting or providing upgrades to close deals. Profit margins narrowed. Fabricated metal manufacturers reported profit drops of nearly 30% in just 6 months. Supply chains grew volatile. Price swings made long-term planning nearly impossible. For Washington, this is trade strategy. For a young couple trying to buy their first home, it is another closed door. The official justification for the additional tariff layer was national security. Lumber was declared a potential threat. No clear explanation was offered as to how Canadian framing lumber jeopardized U.S. security, but under Section 232 authority, the executive branch can impose tariffs if imports are deemed harmful to national interests. And so the extra 10% was applied. Stacked on top of 35%, the combined rate crossed 45%. The expectation in Washington was familiar. Pressure Canada, raise duties, force negotiations. Extract concessions on forest management and stumpage systems. This playbook has repeated for decades in the softwood lumber dispute. But this time, something different happened. Canada did not fold, it pivoted. In August 2025, Ottawa announced a $2.35 billion support package for its forestry sector. Over $1 billion in loan guarantees to keep mills operational during the tariff surge. Hundreds of millions in grants and contributions specifically designed to find new export markets beyond the United States. The message was clear: if the American market becomes hostile, Canada will reduce its exposure to it. Asia became the primary target. China, Japan, South Korea, India, massive construction demand. Rapid urbanization, expanding middle classes. none imposing 45% tariffs on Canadian wood. Canadian producers began redirecting shipments west instead of south. Ports on the Pacific grew busier, trade delegations intensified outreach across Asia. At the same time, Canada launched a forest sector transformation initiative focused on domestic consumption, promote mass timber construction at home, expand modular housing systems using Canadian wood, increase value-added processing. If exports to the United States shrink, absorb more production internally or in alternative markets. This is not retaliation in the dramatic sense. It is economic adaptation, and adaptation reduces leverage. If you are watching closely, understand the deeper shift here. Tariffs are supposed to create pain that compels negotiation. But if the targeted country can redirect trade flows, that pain dulls over time. And once new supply chains are established, they become sticky. Shipping routes get optimized, contracts get signed. Product specifications adjust to new markets. Mills retool for different standards, investment follows demand. Canada still sends a large share of its lumber exports to the United States. But that share has begun to decline, and every percentage point that moves away is not just temporary. It represents infrastructure, relationships, and capital allocation that may never fully revert. Meanwhile, American home builders remain stuck in the middle. They oppose the initial duties. They lobbied against the Section 232 expansion. They met with trade officials. They testified before Congress that housing affordability is itself a matter of national security. None of it stopped the escalation, because in Washington's calculus, lumber is leverage. And leverage is not surrendered easily, but leverage only works if the other side depends on you more than you depend on them. The United States consumes roughly 30% of its lumber from Canada. Replacing that supply entirely would require massive new processing capacity. Industry groups argue capacity has expanded over the last decade, but not nearly fast enough to offset a sudden contraction in Canadian imports. And here lies the paradox. High tariffs reduce Canadian shipments in the short term, but they also suppress construction in the United States. Reduced construction lowers demand. Lower demand reduces incentives for American mills to invest aggressively in new capacity. The result is a constrained system where prices remain elevated and volatility persists. No one truly wins in that environment, except perhaps a small group of domestic producers shielded from competition. The United States Lumber Coalition has long argued that Canadian stumpage systems amount to unfair subsidies. They claim Canadian provinces sell timber harvested from public lands at below-market rates. Canadian officials counter that their systems rely on competitive auctions and reflect legitimate forest management practices. Commerce Department reviews have consistently sided with domestic producers, leading to higher duties year after year. Politically, this approach resonates with protectionist constituencies. Economically, it burdens downstream industries far larger than the sawmill sector itself. Home building employs millions, real estate drives local tax bases. Construction fuels ancillary industries from appliances to furniture to financing. When lumber costs spike, the shock ripples outward. Housing starts fell nearly 10% in a single month during 2025. Confidence indices remained subdued. Builders reported difficulty forecasting input costs. Buyers pulled back in the face of rising prices and high interest rates. And into that fragile system, the 45% tariff remained. If this pattern continues, the long-term risk for the United States is not simply higher lumber prices, it is structural decoupling. Once Canadian producers lock in major contracts across Asia, once logistics chains orient toward Pacific ports instead of border crossings, once mills invest in capacity designed specifically for non-American buyers, the gravitational pull of the U.S. market weakens. And weakened gravity reduces negotiating power. The original goal of the tariffs was to bring Canada to the table under pressure. Instead, they may be accelerating a diversification process that makes American pressure less effective over time. Housing affordability deteriorates. Construction slows, supply shortages persist. And Canada gradually builds a future in which the US market is no longer dominant. This is the unintended consequence of prolonged tariff warfare. Not immediate collapse, gradual realignment. The longer the tariffs remain at 45%, the more the shift hardens into structure rather than strategy. Because trade flows are not emotional, they are logistical. They follow price signals, predictability, and margin stability. When the United States imposes a 45% penalty on Canadian softwood lumber, it does not eliminate Canadian supply overnight. It distorts it. It forces producers to reassess where their product earns the highest reliable return. And increasingly, that answer is not the United States. Canadian exporters looking at volatile American policy see uncertainty layered on top of cost penalties. Anti-dumping reviews can change rates annually. Countervailing duties fluctuate. Section 232 authority can be expanded or removed at executive discretion. For mills planning capital investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars, that unpredictability is toxic. Asia, by contrast, offers something Washington currently does not: stability without punitive stacking. China continues large-scale urban construction. Japan relies heavily on imported timber for residential development. South Korea and India are expanding housing supply for rapidly urbanizing populations. None of those markets impose a 45% tariff wall. None frame Canadian lumber as a national security threat, so Canadian producers diversify. Shipments that once crossed into Washington state or Montana are loaded onto vessels bound for Shanghai or Yokohama. Long-term supply agreements are negotiated. Technical standards are adjusted to meet Asian building codes. Marketing campaigns pivot westward. Infrastructure investment follows demand. And that is where the real consequence emerges. Once a mill retools to serve a specific foreign standard, once logistics corridors are optimized for Pacific export, once capital is deployed to expand port capacity rather than real links to the US border, reversing that shift is not automatic. It becomes path-dependent. Meanwhile, American builders continue operating under cost pressure. Framing lumber may represent 15 to 20% of structural home building costs. When that component becomes volatile or expensive, the entire pricing model shifts. Developers either absorb margin compression, which discourages new starts, or pass costs to buyers, which suppresses demand. Neither outcome increases housing supply. And housing supply is already insufficient. The United States is estimated to be short millions of homes relative to demographic demand. High mortgage rates have already cooled activity. Adding thousands of dollars per unit in tariff-driven cost increases compounds the strain. A $3,000 to $5,000 direct increase in framing lumber per home might not sound catastrophic in isolation, but layered with higher financing costs, land scarcity, labor shortages, and regulatory burdens, it pushes marginal buyers out of qualification ranges. Affordability crises are rarely caused by one variable. They are triggered when multiple stressors converge. Lumber tariffs are one of those stressors. The political framing in Washington emphasizes protection. Domestic producers argue that without tariffs, Canadian imports suppress American mill investment. They point to long-term price averages adjusted for inflation and argue lumber remains historically cheap. They claim domestic capacity has grown and will continue expanding. But capacity growth measured over a decade does not resolve supply shortages in a year. Even if American mills expand output gradually, the gap remains in the near term. And near-term supply determines near-term prices. This creates a contradiction. The policy designed to encourage domestic production simultaneously depresses the downstream industries that consume that production. If construction slows due to high input costs, demand signals for expanded milling capacity weaken. Investors hesitate, mills delay expansion. The feedback loop becomes self-limiting. Canada, by contrast, uses federal support to cushion the transition. The $2.35 billion package is not purely defensive. It is strategic repositioning. Loan guarantees keep mills solvent during tariff turbulence. Grants accelerate exploration of non-U.S. markets. Domestic initiatives promote mass timber construction and modular housing, absorbing more lumber internally. Mass timber in particular represents a structural shift. Large-scale wood construction for mid-rise and commercial buildings increases domestic demand for engineered wood products. If Canada increases its internal consumption of processed timber, dependence on raw exports declines. Value-added manufacturing expands, margins improve. In effect, tariffs intended to punish Canadian producers may be nudging them toward diversification and vertical integration. For Washington, that is the long-term risk, because leverage diminishes when dependency diminishes. If Canada gradually reduces the proportion of lumber exports sent south, American bargaining power weakens. The threat of tariffs loses potency if the target market share shrinks. At that point, duties become symbolic rather than coercive. And symbolism is not built homes. There is also a broader geopolitical context. Trade disputes rarely exist in isolation. Lumber is one arena among many: energy, automotive manufacturing, critical minerals, defense procurement. Each dispute shapes perceptions of reliability. When a country appears willing to weaponize trade flows repeatedly, partners adjust. Canada has begun adjusting, not dramatically, not with inflammatory rhetoric, but with capital allocation and trade missions. The United States may assume its market size guarantees long-term primacy. And it is true that American demand is massive. But markets are not static. Growth in Asia is substantial. Infrastructure expansion across the Indo-Pacific creates sustained demand for building materials. If Canadian exporters secure long-term footholds there, the gravitational pull of the U.S. market weakens incrementally. And once weakened, restoring it requires concessions. This is where the notion of payback enters the conversation. Not revenge in an emotional sense, but economic reciprocity. If Washington imposes record-high tariffs, Canada responds by accelerating diversification. If American builders suffer, Canadian mills seek new buyers. If negotiations stall, structural realignment continues quietly. The damage inside the United States is measurable. Housing starts declined. Builder confidence weakened, incentives increased. Corporate profits in related manufacturing sectors contracted, supply volatility intensified. Consumers faced higher prices at a time of elevated borrowing costs. All of this occurred while the stated policy goal, revitalizing domestic milling and protecting national security, remains only partially achieved. The irony is stark. Tariffs designed to protect American jobs in lumber production risk suppressing employment in home building, construction trades, real estate services, and manufacturing sectors tied to housing. Those downstream industries are far larger than the primary lumber sector itself. Economic ecosystems are interconnected. When one node is insulated, pressure transfers elsewhere. And that pressure is visible in housing affordability data. If the tariffs persist, two futures emerge. In the first, negotiations eventually resume, duties are reduced, and trade flows normalize. Builders gain relief, prices stabilize, Canada maintains diversified options but continues substantial exports south. In this second, tariffs remain high for years. Canadian producers entrench themselves in Asian markets. Domestic Canadian mass timber expansion absorbs more supply. U.S. builders adapt by building fewer homes or substituting materials where possible. The lumber dispute becomes semi-permanent, decoupling becomes structural. Which path unfolds depends on political calculation in Washington, but time is not neutral. Every month that 45% strengthens alternative supply chains. Every shipment to Asia reinforces relationships that did not previously exist at scale. Every mill investment oriented toward Pacific export reduces reliance on the American border. And once that orientation shifts, reversing it requires more than removing tariffs. It requires rebuilding trust. For American families searching for affordable housing, this geopolitical chess match translates into simple arithmetic. Higher input costs, higher sale prices, fewer new starts. Slower supply growth. Housing crises are rarely solved by restricting material supply. They are solved by expanding it. If policy continues to constrain access to the largest external lumber supplier, the supply gap will not close easily. The broader lesson is clear. Trade leverage works best when it is temporary and targeted. When it becomes prolonged and systemic, it incentivizes diversification. Diversification erodes leverage, and when leverage erodes, the original strategic advantage fades. Canada did not initiate the 45% escalation, but it is adapting to it, redirecting exports, supporting mills, expanding domestic use, building a future less exposed to American tariff cycles. The question now is whether Washington recognizes the cost of maintaining pressure in a sector as foundational as housing. Because while tariffs can be imposed overnight, rebuilding housing affordability takes years. And in that time, supply chains do not wait. They move, quietly, permanently.